joining us online, Canada's Sherpa for the G7 Summit, Cindy Termeshuisen. And her role is also known as the personal representative of the Prime Minister to the G7. Cindy previously served in a range of roles at Global Affairs Canada, including as Associate Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Assistant Deputy Minister, Consular, Security and Emergency Management, and Deputy Head of Mission at Canada's embassies in China and Afghanistan. And Cindy, we know you're very busy in the lead up to the Leaders Summit, so you're joining us today from Ottawa, is that right?
That's correct.
Thank you. Well, Cindy, I'm going to throw it over to you, and thank you very much for joining us at this busy time.
Well, look, thank you so much, Jennifer, for the kind introduction, and thank you for allowing me to participate remotely. I really wanted to be there in person, but my office insisted that I go nowhere outside of either Ottawa or Alberta for the next few weeks, given that the G7 summit will take place in exactly 2 weeks from today. So there's a few things left to do, and so I appreciate the opportunity to be able to participate in this really important event remotely. I'm also really honored to be opening up for such a distinguished panel. I know most of the people on the panel, including my predecessor in this role, and I was also very honored to serve under Minister Ed Fast when I was in his department. So it's great to see you again, Mr. Fast. Today's conversation, I think, really highlights the G7's continued role as a platform for addressing our economic and financial challenges, as well as the ongoing geopolitical crises that we are all too familiar with. So let me begin by maybe sharing a few thoughts on Canada's approach to the G7 and why I think this forum remains important for us and for our G7 partners. You know, for many of you who follow multilateral issues and multilateral fora, the G7's a pretty unique forum. It operates without a permanent secretariat. It has no formal terms of reference. Its decisions are made by consensus. And that gives it a lot of flexibility and also gives a lot of opportunity for the country that is hosting in a given year, which is Canada this year, to really put its stamp on the presidency. And when we reflect back on the past 5 decades of the G7, and it is 5 decades, this year is the 50th anniversary of the G7, I think it's fair to say that the G7 has allowed us in many ways to foster an era of unprecedented stability and economic prosperity. The system it helped to create, based on rules and coordination, has arguably improved economic integration, multilateral engagement, and cross-border investments. But I think we can all say today that that system is under very severe strain indeed, both due to long-term economic and political trends, but also due to more recent shocks. And this is, of course, being felt across the G7 and around the world on a daily basis. There are no winners when economic tensions and risks escalate like they are today. And I would argue that the need for a forum such as the G7 to face these challenges is as true now as it was 50 years ago. I think it's useful to remind ourselves that the G7 was created at a moment of crisis quite similar to the one we are in today in many ways. G6 leaders met in Rambouillet, France in November of 1975 for their first meeting, and they focused on the oil crisis, the dire state of the Bretton Woods system, and the ongoing global recession of the day. And the declaration coming out of that first summit that year, among other things, talked about the group's united commitment to promoting free trade, multilateralism, cooperation with the developing world, etc. And leaders also established plans for future gatherings to take place regularly every year. Canada joined this body the following year in 1976, and with one exception, leaders have gathered every single year since then. And so this year, the challenges for all of us in many ways remain quite similar to what leaders faced in 1975. And there is still a need to face crisis and uncertainty head on with boldness, creativity, and conviction together. So this brings me to say a few words about the areas of work under our 2025 presidency. There's still a lot of active discussion ongoing about initiatives and outcomes, and this will obviously be shaped by the consensus-based nature of the group. But I can say that many of the things we are working on build on past G7 discussions and are informed by the very helpful recommendations that we've received from many partners and stakeholders, including the network of G7 engagement groups that many of you are familiar with and some of you are active in, like the Business 7, the Civil 7, and the Think Tank 7. We've also been engaged with other countries, South Africa in particular, as the presidency of the G20 this year. And we've been working with other regional groupings like APEC, ASEAN, CARICOM, and the Gulf Cooperation Council to ensure that we get their input, but also that we share some of our thinking for this year. And those conversations have really influenced the areas of focus that we have taken on. One thing I will say is that on the economic side, many of the areas that we are currently working on have a cross-cutting economic resilience component. This is something that I think you will see in a couple of weeks when we host the G7 as a thematic that will cut across many of the discussions leaders are having. We are taking a very streamlined approach to the G7 this year for, I think, fairly obvious domestic and international reasons. But I think it's fair to say that you can expect leaders to focus on the most pressing economic and geopolitical issues of the day and to build on the work streams that have been the mainstay of the G7 for the last few years. You can also expect that Canada will invite non-G7 partners to join G7 leaders for some of these discussions. And you can expect that our core values will continue to underpin our agenda. I should maybe close by saying that while all eyes are on the G7 summit that will take place in a couple of weeks, the G7 is a year-long endeavor, and while the leaders component is extremely important, of course, there's much more to the G7 than the leaders component. As many of you will know, we've had a number of ministerials this year. Foreign ministers met in March, finance ministers met in May. There will be a fair number of ministerials as well in the fall, but it is definitely a long-term, whole of year undertaking. And we look forward to having your input from this session that will feed into the work that we'll be doing at leaders level and elsewhere in the G7 this year. So thank you for the opportunity to say a few words, and I look forward to hearing from the panel.
Thank you so much, Cindy, for starting us off on a very relevant foot, and wishing you and your team good luck, because it's a heavy lift, especially this particular summit. So I'd like to introduce our panel and welcome them up to the stage. Peter Boehm was appointed to the Senate of Canada in October 2018, representing the province of Ontario. He has served as ambassador to Germany, minister at the Embassy of Canada to the United States of America, and ambassador to the OAS, among other foreign postings. Senator Boehm is a former Deputy Minister of International Development and Senior Associate Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, and he also served several prime ministers as Canada's Sherpa for international summits, including the G7 and including at Charlevoix in 2018. Welcome, Peter.
Do I go up now?
Yes. Now, Clay, you have to remember, you'll remind me of the order, because my order on the page is not the same. Okay, Alan, you're next. Alan Gogbashian is Deputy Trade Commissioner for North America for the United Kingdom. Previously, Alan was His Majesty's Consul General to Chicago from January 2020 to July 2024, and led the UK's engagement across 14 states. That's a big job. You're based in New York now, Alan? Commissioner Didier Renders between December 2019 and August 2024. Welcome, Geneviève. Last but not least, Ed. Ed Fast was the Member of Parliament for Abbotsford from 2006 to 2025. As Minister of International Trade under Prime Minister Stephen Harper, he led Canada's negotiations on free trade agreements with the European Union, South Korea, Ukraine, and the original Trans-Pacific Partnership countries. He's also a corporate and commercial lawyer in BC. Welcome. So that was a good introduction to the G7 and history by Cindy. And she made the case for why the G7 is still important. But I want to hear from the four of you. Is the G7 still relevant? It's not a grouping of the world's biggest democracies or the world's biggest economies. The world's changed a lot in 50 years. Is this grouping still relevant? Ed, I'll start with you.
Definitely yes. And I think our starting point should be the fact that the G7 is rooted in a common set of values. Democracy, freedom, human rights, the rule of law, and historically has also been very supportive of liberalized trade around the world. I believe historically the G7 understood the value of comparative advantage and the ability of freer and fairer trade to raise prosperity outcomes around the world. And when prosperity outcomes around the world, especially in developing countries, is raised, that's good, not only for those countries, but for developed countries like Canada, like the United States, like the EU. So I'm a great supporter of the G7, but it's facing challenges because one of our partners has turned inward, has moved towards isolationism, away from multilateralism, and that's a discussion presumably we'll get into going forward.
Oh, we will. Geneviève?
Thank you, Jennifer, and good afternoon, everyone. To your question, my reply is very clear: yes, and yes, and yes. This is relevant even more than before, especially now. We need to have this space where politicians, high-level politicians, have the possibility to discuss with each other. It's there is no majority vote, or it is consensus. They need to understand each other's position. That's maybe also very important today, to understand each other, to exchange, and even if it's difficult sometimes and the positions are very far apart, but they have this space. So for me, this is indispensable, this is essential in the world today. And for the EU, this is particularly true. We are very honored to be associated to the G7 work. You know that the EU was invited in 1977 at the London Summit, and in Kananaskis you will see two presidents, the President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, and the President of the European Council, together leading the EU delegation. So of course I have no hesitation to your question. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you. Alan?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to be very boring and agree. We want a bit of controversy and mixed opinions, but on this one, I fundamentally 100% agree. Not just that the G7 is still relevant, I think it's needed more than ever. This grouping is needed more than ever. We need like-minded countries, like-minded democracies, committed to human rights, committed to international prosperity, to be speaking, to be like-minded, to be aligned as much as possible. And, of course, there are disagreements. This isn't the first time there have been disagreements within the G7 in its 50 years. There have been deep disagreements before, but as a grouping, we have always come through them. And let's not forget that there are plenty of things where we are very much still aligned and like-minded. If you read the communique that issued after the foreign ministers gathering in Banff, the G7 foreign ministers, you will see the breadth of collaboration, partnership, like-mindedness within that communique on really fundamental global economic issues. So absolutely, the G7 remains an essential body.
Peter, are you going to go in a different direction?
Well, since my career was built on the G7, you're not going to get a dissenting voice from me. Look, I think anything that has lasted 50 years and involves politicians, if they don't find it useful, they would have stopped going. And they do find it useful, and I've had the great privilege of being with some of our leaders when they were going to their first one or their second one, and you could see a bit of nervousness at the beginning, but then they really take to it. And what makes it is the informality. And Cindy mentioned in her opening remarks, there's a whole cottage industry there too. It's Alan talked about the finance ministers meeting in Banff there, and the foreign ministers meeting in Charlevoix. There are inputs that come from these ministerial meetings, from these groups, and there are groups that are below the waterline that continue to work. Group on cyber terrorism, on cyber security. The Financial Action Task Force to look at money laundering was a G7 invention. It now has almost 200 countries participating in that. Chernobyl and the financing required to put a secure dome on the still reactive reactor was a G7 initiative. The injection of $5 trillion of liquidity into global markets in 2020 because of the pandemic was a G7 initiative, and that was then taken up by the G20 as well. So there's a whole list, and over our history, and this is the 7th one that Canada will be hosting, there have been various great Canadian initiatives too, regardless of who was Prime Minister.
I'm thinking maternal and child health initiative.
That's a good one, and out of Charlevoix, the funding for the education of women and girls in conflict zones. We tried for $400 million, and we ended up getting $3.2 billion for that. So they don't necessarily make the big headlines. It's usually if there's a faux pas or someone gets annoyed or there's a tweet or a posting, things can go a little sideways. But
Right.
I guess we're going to talk about that too.
Well, so Peter, speaking of Charlevoix, you were there in 2018. That was Donald Trump's first, second. Charlevoix was second. There was some question about whether he was going to come to the G7 meeting in Kananaskis. Apparently he's coming. Who knows, that might change at any moment. But what kind of dynamic do you think he brings to this meeting by his presence?
Well, that's a very interesting question because the first summit that he attended was in Taormina in Sicily in 2017. If you've seen the second season of The White Lotus, that was shot in Taormina, and the Canadian delegation stayed in the same hotel. Okay, just so you know. So we were all wondering, all leaders and Sherpas, what is he going to be like? And he was very much in listening mode at that one. And then a year later, with a new team, because some had left, his Sherpa had been fired. There was another Sherpa. His various other advisors too were different. He was a bit more seasoned and wanted to engage in debate, particularly on climate change. And I have written about that because the U.S. was still in the Paris Agreement in 2017, but then they got out. Then they came back in under Biden, and now they're out again. So we've seen that yin yang on the part of various administrations. But Mr. Trump came in to Charlevoix concentrating more on a meeting that was sometime in the future, 4 or 5 days, meeting Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, in Singapore. And that was seemed to be a bigger concern for him. In my experience, without telling too many stories out of school, he prefers one-on-one bilateral meetings. We've seen a few lively ones in the Oval Office, including the one with our Prime Minister, Mark Carney, rather than sitting around a table and getting into really deep discussion. And we had to think about this in 2018 because usually, and the great chronicler John Curtin is here of G7 summitry. But usually the discussion opens with the U.S. president talking about the global economy. So we had to figure out how to do this in 2018. And the idea that Prime Minister Trudeau and I had was to get Mr. Trump talking about his tax cut, because he was very proud of it, the one bill that he put through in the tax cut. And that's where it started. But then he lost interest once Angela Merkel, Emmanuel Macron, and others started chiming in on macroeconomic issues, fiscal responsibility, and the like. So the idea is to get a topic that he will be interested in. And obviously, that one for Kananaskis will be tariffs, but I suspect there will be more of that in bilateral meetings than around the table.
Thank you. Ed, obviously the G7, the other 6 leaders are going to make the case to Trump. I mean, I'm making a big assumption here, but they're going to make the case that what he's been doing is hurting the global economy, and ultimately will hurt the United States if it's not already. He might not listen to them. What would be a best case scenario for Mark Carney, Prime Minister Carney, as a host? The best case scenario for Canada as the host coming out of the G7 of what could be accomplished?
Well, I certainly expect that the G6, the remainder of the countries, will make a very strong case for trade, for freer trade, for trade liberalization, for respect for the global rules-based order, for multilateralism. But I think a note of caution is required, because the Trump era, like virtually all political movements, will disappear eventually. The MAGA movement, perhaps not so quickly, but we have to be prepared for a time when the U.S. may reap the consequences of Trump's economic and tariff policies, and it'll come back to bite not only their economy but individual Americans, so that we're in a position where the G7 can continue to function and embrace a return by the U.S. back to conventional political and economic policy. And so I would want to be very careful. I believe Prime Minister Carney can play a key role in guiding the discussion towards consensus areas that have already been mentioned by some of the panelists here, to areas that maybe Donald Trump has some interest in, perhaps the most important one being global security, continental security, which he has a keen interest in, and avoid isolating the U.S. to the point where they say, well, we're going to exit the G7. I believe the day is coming when the G7 will return to a more normal tone and tenor, where we'll return to conventional diplomacy, conventional discussions about economic policy, multilateralism going forward.
I like this optimism. So all of the issues that are being discussed at the G7 are interrelated. We're talking about trade. We're obviously talking about global security and defense. We're going to be talking about energy, probably AI, everything interrelated. But I want to talk about Ukraine. President Zelensky has been invited, and we expect to attend. This is of particular urgency to Europe, the situation in Ukraine. Geneviève, can you tell us what the EU hopes will come out of this particular summit with regard to Ukraine, and what case could be made to the US that what happens in Ukraine is important for Americans as well?
Thank you, Jennifer. I would say 2 words, unity and determination. Since the beginning of the war in 2022, be it under the German presidency, the Japanese, the Italian, and I hope, and I'm sure, the Canadian G7 presidency, the support to Ukraine has been immediate and remarkable. Full support. I mean support, military support, financial support, support concerning possible additional sanctions, and now, of course, we are discussing also reconstruction and accountability. So on all these topics, I think for the EU, this is a key topic, but not just for the EU, and not because it's a war on the European soil, but because it concerns the security of the world. And a lot of other regions are looking at what we do, how we react to that. So that's the reason why we should consider that Russia should not be awarded for the war of aggression. So we have to pay attention to what we do. And I think that a strong political signal from the G7 leaders in Kananaskis in their showing their unity and supporting Ukraine would be essential, because it would also put pressure again on Russia and give Ukrainian the strength to negotiate. This is what they need now as well. So in my view, for the EU, this is absolutely key, and in my view, it would be a success if the G7 in Kananaskis can reaffirm its commitment and its unwavering, as we say, support towards Ukraine.
I just wanted to pick up on something you said about sending a signal to other parts of the world, and this is happening against a backdrop of China and a major military build-up there. So multiple fronts of interest that I'm sure the leaders will be talking about. Alan, the UK and the EU signed a strategic partnership on defense. I think you'll tell us about the details, but just for everybody's reference, the EU has created a $235 billion Security Action for Europe fund, which is part of a $1.25 trillion defense industrial initiative, Rearm Europe, which Prime Minister Carney has said he wants Canada to be a part of. What should we know about the state of negotiations there between the EU and UK, and the significance of that agreement?
So as you said, everything is interrelated. And just picking up briefly again on the Ukraine point, this is exactly why we can't isolate the US in the G7. We don't want to, we shouldn't. There won't be a solution to the conflict in Ukraine without President Trump, without the US. So this is exactly why we need to have a strong G7 and not a G6. We absolutely need the US at the table for that. So with the EU, we're very pleased with the way the relationship has been regenerated. I think there's a new positive dynamism in the UK's relationship with the EU, and our Prime Minister Keir Starmer has made very clear that this should deepen, this should continue. There are so many common interests between the UK and the EU. There's the economic side of it, which remains extremely dynamic, but the security and defense side, of course, is fundamental at the moment. So we're very happy with the way the conversation has started, and we are looking to deepen that commitment in terms of our partnership. And nowhere is this more important than Ukraine. As Geneviève said, we have stood shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine from the beginning as the UK, and we will until the very end, until there is a lasting peace. And you mentioned, what will be discussed at the G7. Without wishing to preempt the conversation or the agenda, absolutely we'll want to be sending a unified, strong signal. But there might also be potential, depending on how the conversations go, on talking about what a coalition of the willing might look like when it comes to security guarantees to protect the peace once we get there, hopefully sooner rather than later.
Very interesting. Thank you. Peter, can you talk to us about Canadian interests in this area, thinking both with regard to the security situation with Ukraine, but also opportunities on the defense industrial side for Canada?
How much time do we have? Just one thing off the top, and I've been thinking about this, and it's totally unrelated to this question, but I just want to say it. The G7 was the G8 for 16 years. Mm-hmm. And that's something to bear in mind. And Canada was quite instrumental under Prime Minister Harper to make the arithmetic work at G7, because it was increasingly clear that the Russian participation wasn't helping. But that gets to the defense argument as well. So Prime Minister Carney visited Paris and London very quickly after he came into office. He's made his statements about working with Europe on defense. Canada is the 7th largest gross contributor to NATO. And we have had a brigade in Latvia for 11 years. I think it started under the Harper government, went through the Trudeau period as well. So it's not like we're shirking things. However, if the call at the NATO summit coming 10 days after the Kananaskis one is to really go to 5%, depending on how you break that down, obviously that is going to be a big challenge for Canada. Canada is in the market for new submarines. The fighter deal on the F-35s has been signed. The question is, how many would we want, and are there others that we might want instead of, given the technicalities of both the sale and the execution of the project. In the speech from the throne, there was a commitment to really up our defense spending and be there, and this goes beyond the NORAD renewal, which was a feature of the last government. And with the changes in the Arctic, and don't forget the Prime Minister, after going to London and Paris, he went straight to Iqaluit, so there's a bit more than just symbolism in that. The challenges in the Arctic are only going to increase, and that has to be a focus for us. The deal struck with Australia in terms of electronic surveillance equipment that can be deployed for the Arctic, I think, is significant. And of course, the commitment to speak with the peoples of the North candidly and openly, and we're of course celebrating Indigenous relations today, is also going to be an important factor. So this is a huge issue for us, and if we're talking nation building, as the Prime Minister has, then that means really stepping up on that issue as well.
Just to follow up on that, do you think there'll be some bilateral conversations in the hallways between, let's say, Canada, Italy, Canada, the UK, in terms of defense possibilities? Is that the type of conversation that would happen?
Well, the beauty of a G7 meeting is that you have these terms of art. You can have a sit-down bilateral meeting. You can have a bump into, which is also choreographed. And you can have a brush by, which is shorter, but also planned.
Is this an actual term, a brush by?
Oh, yeah. No, there's a whole lexicon of terminology out there for the pull-aside.
I've heard a
Thank you,
pull-aside,
David.
but not a brush by.
There's the pull-aside as well. So I think there will be a lot. I just wrote about this in Policy Magazine, but there will be a lot more bilateral meetings than usual at this summit. Obviously, the new leaders, that includes Carney as the host, but Merz as the new German Chancellor, and Starmer, this will be his first G7 summit, although he's been in office for a bit. They're going to want to sit down and talk with each other and talk to others. So the challenge for the Sherpa and her team is to build in enough time for those very vital conversations while still preserving the conversations that will take place around the big table.
Ed, Canada, of all the countries, probably knows the U.S. the best. Sorry, UK, but we are right next to the U.S. Is there a scenario where we act as a sort of intermediary between the U.S. and other nations? Would that work?
Absolutely. In fact, I think we can make a very strong case that Canada understands the U.S. better than most of the U.S.'s partners around the world, simply because of our proximity geographically, our highly integrated economies, our shared values, really a common history even, and Canada being a middle power. And by the way, I believe we can restore some of the luster of that middle power going forward. We may have lost some of that over the last few years, but I think we can recapture that. And I'm hoping our new Prime Minister actually leads the discussions in a way where the bilaterals you were referring to, Peter, happen, that they're actually constructive. I mean, obviously the most important bilaterals will still be, certainly from Canada's perspective, will be between Canada and the US. I don't have high hopes that a lot of consensus will emerge from those, but there are a number of key areas of consensus that I think could form part of a communique that comes out of the G7. But it'll likely focus on security, what happens in Ukraine going forward. The other G6 countries have made a very clear commitment to Ukraine going forward. And you referred to the coalition of the willing. The G6 are a coalition of the willing when it comes to security in that part of the world. And I expect that these discussions are going to be productive, not necessarily always result in a consensus.
On the trade issue for Canada, where would you see the Prime Minister wanting to focus his pull-asides and, I was going to say brush off, but what did you call it? Brush by. That's probably what Trump is going to do. No, but where do you see the key conversations that Carney could have in the hallways?
Well, Canada has free trade agreements with all of the G7 countries except the UK, and I hope we have a continuity agreement, but not a new trade agreement with the UK going forward. And my hope is that we'll actually be able to re-energize those discussions going forward. But the fact that all of the remaining G6 countries, including the UK with its continuity agreement, have trade agreements with each other, we have an opportunity to improve the trade that happens between us. The challenge for Canadians, and I'll focus on Canada's economy and our small businesses, our medium-sized enterprises, is that we are risk averse. We are used to doing business with the largest economy in the world, with a common language, a currency that we understand, a culture we understand, the rule of law, and all of that. Penetrating new markets, many Canadian companies are very risk averse and have not yet done so. And one of the challenges is, wherever you go, you're going to have tariff and non-tariff barriers that really strangle the ability of smaller enterprises to understand what they're facing, what are their prospects of success in those markets. But there's something new that's emerged, and we had an earlier discussion with some of our visitors here. There's something called data analytics, AI-driven data analytics, where the trillions of pieces of information around the world that's related to supply chains, markets, can now be synthesized into digestible information for small and medium-sized enterprises. There's a number of platforms now that have enabled SMEs to actually participate in markets like the EU. For me, that's exciting because I don't believe Canadian companies have actually taken up that challenge. If you're a large Canadian national or multinational, you have all the resources you need to penetrate those markets. But if you're a small business, you think there's an opportunity, you're probably going to be intimidated if you don't have those resources available to you.
I see Geneviève nodding. So we, as Ed knows full well, we've had an agreement with Europe, the CETA, since 2017, a trade agreement. And trade has been growing between Canada and the EU in those intervening years. But I think we'd all probably agree not enough. Geneviève, can you tell us how we could be doing better and in the areas of growth that you see?
Yes, thank you, Jennifer. So I take my fishes because I have some figures to share with you. So you are right, our trade agreement, the CETA, and congratulations for being part of the negotiation process, So the CETA is in place and is provisionally applicable since 2017. And this is a real success. Just to give you some figures, since its application, nearly 99% of tariffs between the EU and Canada have been eliminated. And according to our statistics, this has contributed to an increase of 65% of our bilateral trade in goods and 73% of our bilateral trade in services. So that's quite a lot. But this is not enough, and we know that because the problem is that sometimes CETA's provisions are not well known by companies. I was surprised because at the beginning of my mandate, I visited British Columbia, and we had lots of discussion with Business Council, and we were amazed to see the figures that some companies didn't know about CETA. Alors, sometimes they know, but they consider that it's maybe too burdensome to use CETA and to trade under CETA's provision. Sometimes there is a question of not just the paperwork, but the question, is there really an interest compared to not trading under CETA's provision? So what we noticed that we need to raise awareness. We need to organize some very focused, maybe training session or matching operation between EU companies and Canadian companies. So there is still a lot to do to be sure that CETA is fully implemented. So the Commission, the European Commission, has recently commissioned a report to analyze the way CETA was implemented. So we have now received the first draft report, and I can share with you, the document has been, is public now. I can share with you the first comments on this. But the first point, this is an important one, and I mentioned it already, CETA works. So this is a confirmation that it has increased trade, goods and services, but also in terms of GDP. So this is an important point to make. The second point is that there are some sectors for which CETA is not well known enough, especially in automotive, boats, furniture, and clothing. So that's something we need to improve. Clothing, sorry, for my French accent.
Les vêtements, des vêtements.
Voilà, les vêtements. So, and there may be some progress to made on the regulatory part, cooperation, and on digital trade. So these are the first comments from this report that will be followed by recommendation. That means that the EU Commission will work on that with Canadian, of course. But we have been looking at that at the EU delegation in Ottawa with the support of our Canadian friends, and we discussed the way to improve this, the more to spread and to amplify what CETA could bring to each other. So there are some ongoing reflection to do that. But one point maybe I would like to mention is the point related to investments. So we consider that there is not enough investments from the EU to Canada and from Canada to the EU as well. So, and it's maybe, and I have to say that the EU has to do its part as well, because some part of the CETA are not fully in application because some member states have not ratified yet CETA. 10 member states still have to ratify. So that's something, if they ratify, we could have this provision on investment protection. This might help to encourage investment. But on the other hand, I think that investment could also be encouraged by the Canadian. European investment, maybe in some project of common interest. I know that there are currently some discussion between the federal government and provinces on this, and maybe this could be also open to European investment. So there is a lot to do.
Sounds like there's a lot of opportunity.
Voilà, a lot of opportunity, and I have no doubt that our leaders, because we will have soon a summit between the EU and Canada in Brussels, I have no doubt that this question will be on the table.
Thank you. So Alan, Ed mentioned this, these ongoing talks between the UK and Canada on a trade agreement, which have stopped over some agricultural issues. Can you give us a sense of where things are at? Could this summit be a kind of, I don't know, loosening up of the talks if Prime Minister Starmer and Carney get to talk during that time?
By the way, since we're talking about G7 and vernacular, the UK does bilaterals and brush bys. We don't do pull-asides or bump-intos. They're far too aggressive. So we have the trade continuity agreement that I mentioned before.
What does that
the
mean?
TCA. So the trade continuity, the TCA essentially rolled over the arrangements we had when we were members of the European Union on trade, and then refreshed them and updated them. So it's not a full FTA, but it's the next best thing, if you like, and it covers 90% of the trade between the UK and Canada. And it's working. So we've seen over the last 10 years trade increase by 40% between Canada and the UK. So the TCA is delivering. So it's around about 50 billion Canadian dollars last year. Trade was. More or less, and investment as well. The trajectory on investment has been equally dynamic. Do we go and do a full FTA? We've talked about it before, as you know, and negotiations did take place. I wouldn't say it's off the table. I think Mr. Carney and this government haven't had very long to get their feet under the desk yet, but we will pick up on that conversation at the right time. But in the meantime, whether that transpires or doesn't, we don't sit and kind of twiddle our thumbs. There's lots of things we're doing to deepen the trade relationship, to remove market barriers. Last time I was in Toronto just a few months ago at the Consul General's residence, and our Consul General for Toronto is here. She hosted an event where we celebrated the signing of a mutual recognition agreement allowing architects in the UK to work much more freely and easily in Canada, and Canadian architects to do the same in the UK. And that's really just opened up a whole new level of dynamism in that sector. And we're hoping to do the same in other industries like engineering. So we don't just sit and wait for FTAs. There's lots going on already. But there's plenty of things we can do to deepen the relationship all the time. And a lot of that doesn't perhaps reach the media the way it should. But it sends, again, a positive signal at a time of international volatility that like-minded countries can deepen their trading relationship all the time, even now,
Right.
and remove friction in all kinds of sectors.
Can I ask you, is Canada, I mean, we are, very navel-gazy as a country, I would say. Is Canada on the UK's radar? After Keir Starmer's meeting in Washington, it kind of, there was a comment from our Prime Minister.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we have such deep links with Canada. The King of Canada bears a striking resemblance to the King of the United Kingdom. So our ties are deep. We have the Commonwealth links, we have the people-to-people links, but they're not just historical. There's so much we're doing together right now, all the time, every day. We're both Five Eyes partners. There's a huge amount going on of security cooperation, intelligence cooperation that goes on. Our defense industries are incredibly aligned with more and more integration in terms of supply chain integration in that sphere. And we're doing more together on nuclear, civil nuclear, fusion and fission. We're having conversations about what we can do to make sure that we are aligning on our AI policy, our quantum policy. So just last year we signed a really comprehensive, far-reaching science and innovation memorandum with Canada. So Canada is firmly on the UK's radar and always will be.
Okay, I feel better now. Peter, one of the things that came up with the G7 finance ministers was, a collective statement about countries that play by the rules and rules-based trade and so on. And I mean, the the message was to China or about China. I think we can agree on that. How do you see the China question playing out at the Leaders Summit? And I guess a second question to that would be, is there a tipping point where if the U.S. continues to put pressure on our countries, that we can stay aligned with the U.S. on shutting China out of certain markets? Sort of a big question there, but.
Thanks, Jennifer. It is a big question. In all of the G7 meetings I've attended as Sherpa, and even before as I was more junior in the system, China has come up as an issue. It certainly did at Charlevoix, because we the Sherpas had negotiated a mechanism whereby all member countries could be in touch with each other in terms of Chinese interests, if there was an interest in taking over a company in one country or another, and of course because of dumping on the market, certainly of steel. There was an OECD mechanism established, but we wanted to go further. Everyone was on board until President Trump decided he wasn't, and instead he was going to put a tariff on steel and aluminum on all of the G7 countries. So we have in Canada, and this is obviously a public policy issue, followed the lead of the Americans. It was the Biden administration that put a 100% tariff on electric vehicles coming out of China. It was the Biden administration also that indicated great discomfort with the prospect that China would build an electric vehicle plant in Mexico, so our other partner in the CUSMA. We, of course, followed suit. But if our auto industry is being attacked the way it is, then we might have to look at other options. We have Japanese plants in Ontario. We might have other options as well in terms of battery plants. Previous government had done some very big deals with Volkswagen and with Stellantis on that. So this will be a subject, I think, of some discussion, and we can't forget that as we move back and forth between tariffs being imposed and then withdrawn, and the prospect of another Trump-Xi conversation before the summit itself, that all leaders will be thinking about what they can do.
Thank you. Just looking at the times, I want to leave some time for questions, but I'll just go down the line here and ask one last question for you. Is we have the G7 Leader Summit is the start of a busy summit season. So as Geneviève mentioned, there's going to be a Canada-EU summit. There's also the NATO summit coming up. Can you give us a sense of what you think we should be watching for, key moments that are going to be unfolding in the coming months? And of course, it's been a very unpredictable time, but hazard a guess. Ed? Sorry.
I think the point I would make is that Donald Trump has created a huge vacuum in the world with his withdrawal from multilateralism. And I believe it's incumbent upon the rest of us in the G7 to do everything we can to fill that vacuum going forward. And given the fact that the members of the G7 are also members of many different multilateral fora coming up, whether it's the WTO or the OECD, NATO, all of them implicate different areas of our bilateral and multilateral relationships, right? And going forward, there has to be a serious discussion amongst the coalition of the willing. Those of us who still believe strongly in multilateralism, that believe in trade liberalization, to actually come up with new ways of doing that. So I would just piggyback on comments that were made earlier about the Canada-UK relationship. I'm going to throw this out there. We have an opportunity to expand on that. And we also have something called the Commonwealth that the UK and New Zealand and Australia and Canada are part of. why not take that and turn it into an agreement? There's been proposals for a Kanzuk agreement, 4 countries that share a Commonwealth heritage, that share the rule of law, that share a common language, and a common approach to these issues we've talked about here on the panel, and maybe do a harvesting of the low-hanging fruit, maybe a mobility agreement.
So
right?
that agreement you were talking about would be Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and
Yes,
UK.
and the UK, right? So filling a vacuum, wherever we have an opportunity to start to backfill the vacuum that Donald Trump has left, I think is the opportunity we have going forward, not only at these upcoming summits, but as we have bilaterals, to encourage our most like-minded partners to be part of that coalition of the willing.
Thank you. Geneviève?
Well, on all these topics, in my view, the common denominator is values. EU and Canada share the same values. This should be the starting point on everything. And we will have more cooperation with Canada, EU-Canada, on security and defense. You mentioned the agreement signed with the UK, EU-UK, but the EU is currently negotiating with Canada security and defense partnership, and this will open the way, open a path to possible cooperation in terms of industrial defense. So you know that the EU has adopted this rearm plan, and in this plan there is a proposal to borrow, the EU will make possible the access for the member states to 150 billion euro in terms of loans to increase the defense capabilities. And this will be open to third countries who have signed a security and defense partnership. So Canada could be part of that cooperation on defense industry. So, but again, coming back to values on Ukraine, support to Ukraine, on AI, sharing a common vision for AI and quantum technologies, or even on critical material, values is what unites us. So I would say that it could be the fil rouge of all these different summits, being NATO, EU-Canada summit, and the G7, strong partnership with our allies, like-minded countries sharing the same values.
Thank you. Alan?
Well, I hope the succession of summits and international gatherings provide opportunities to resolve some of these conflicts, of course. So whether that's the Middle East, the Ukraine, the sooner we see these resolved, the better, of course. That's number one. I agree with everything that Ed and Geneviève said already. I would just add that we all want international growth, economic growth. We all want prosperity, but we don't want to do that at the expense of national security issues at a time of volatility, especially. So I think something that will need to be on the agenda at these gatherings is an even greater emphasis on de-risking supply chains, leaning into relationships with like-minded allies when it comes to integrating supply chains, whether that's in defense, AI, other really important sectors, critical minerals, for example. We can't sit back and let the kind of the status quo when it comes to supply chains just continue. So we need to continue de-risking that, and that means deepening supply chain integration with like-minded allied countries, and we're better to start than the G7.
And there's a crossover between defense supply chains, critical minerals, and what Canada has in abundance. We have a lot of manufacturing capability here, and also a significant critical mineral industry here.
This morning I was speaking in Montreal at the Canadian Aluminum, however you want to choose to say it, association, and this was absolutely critical to the discussion there, the nexus between global national security and critical minerals.
Thank you. Peter?
Two last points. One, in all of this talk about tariffs and trade, no one has ever mentioned, and I include the media in this, the World Trade Organization. Is it on life support? And it may have been for some time because the Biden administration decided not to approve members of the appellate body that would look at appeals from panel decisions made by the WTO. Canada's been leading a group called the Ottawa Group of trade ministers who have been trying to reform the institution, but also get it off the life support that it's on now. And it's very dubious just how the WTO is going to continue. My second point, you'll like this, Jennifer, is we can't forget about Mexico in this
Yes,
country.
thank you, because
And
President Scheinbaum might
Mexico is our third largest merchandise trade partner. Canadian energy companies have $6.5 billion invested in Mexico, including in the grid. So at the beginning of this crisis, when premiers were talking about going it alone and forgetting about Mexico, that's not so easy for us, and we have to realize too that the big transport lifeline is the Canadian Pacific Kansas City Railway, and its headquarters are in Calgary, and this links all three countries. So that is why, I mean, whether President Scheinbaum comes to Kananaskis or not, I think issuing the invitation to her was an important step. I had the privilege of being at her inauguration on October 1st, combination of Truth and Reconciliation Day and a confidence vote in the House, so you sent a senator. And I had a very good conversation with her. She's open to Canada, and we're going to have to work together because we've got the juggernaut sitting geographically between us.
Thank you. So I want to move to questions, and my colleague Claire Desjardins has a microphone. Mark.
Thank you for coming here to Toronto to talk to us today. So I have a reputation for asking controversial questions, so maybe I'll do that. Most of the Canadian reporting about this defense thing never mentions money. All the UK reporting mentions money. It's a big discussion between the two of you, so maybe I can get you guys to talk a little bit about what Canada would have to contribute before we get the privilege of actually becoming part of it and bringing some more of that manufacturing to Canada. And if I could have a second question, because we're across from the LCBO, which is where we buy our alcohol. And you know, we don't sell American wines or spirits in our alcohol stores, but our provinces have a Buy Canadian policy. How do you feel about Buy Canadian policy when the only other competing products on the shelves are from Britain and Italy and France? Is that in the spirit of multilateralism and free trade, or do you have any thoughts about Canadian policies in that regard? In response to Trump, we're hitting you guys. How do you feel about that? So my two questions.
Okay, so that's for Geneviève and Alan. Yep. So I think the first question was about the funds that Canada needs to put on the table for defense. Is that?
Yeah. Become part of the program.
Well, no, maybe I will try to explain a bit better what is at stake here. So the EU, but defense is on the top of the agenda, of course, and even more than before. Just to give you an illustration of that, the new EU Commission has 27 EU commissioners, and for the first time ever, we have now a commissioner responsible for defense. So you know how these things are maybe sometimes a political signal. So this commissioner for defense has been tasked by the president to prepare a plan for EU defense. You have to know that in the EU, defense is a topic very sensitive because it touches sovereignty, and the member states are reluctant to delegate some powers to the EU Commission. So now we have something very new in the EU, because with the EU Rearm Europe plan, we will try together to intensify our defense capabilities, meaning that we need to push the member state to invest more in defense, to spend money in their security. And for that, the plan has been to propose different sort of things. The first one is this so-called SAFE plan with 150 billion euro available in the form of loans for the member states. So they will have the possibility to access to these loans at good condition of the market, because the EU Commission will have favorable commission on the market, and they will be able to use this money to invest in their defense industry. And in that respect, this plan is open to some of the third countries, accession countries or candidate countries to the EU, but also partners with whom the EU has signed security and defense partnership. That's where we are now. The UK has just signed with the EU this security and defense partnership, and Canada and the EU are negotiating this possibility. That means concretely that with this security and defense partnership, Canada will have the possibility to join some EU member states who have access to these loans and money. So that means they will be able to join force in their defense industry. I'm not sure it's clear enough. I know it's a bit complex, but that means that it opens possibility to invest together in our defense industry. That doesn't mean that the Canadian have to pay to access to that. Sorry?
But you want the British to pay it, so I can't see a scenario where Canada's not going to have to pay it.
No, the situation is the same for the UK with the security and defense partnership. They have access in a cooperation with one or two member states. They have the possibility to spend money and to have access to these loans via the member states. Maybe you want to collect.
I can't really add to that. That's a great summary, but perhaps I can pick up on your second question. Thank you for the question. When it comes to Buy Canadian or similar policies in other countries, I mean, that's really for Canada to decide. It's not for the UK to comment on that. That's your decision. That's your domestic policy. I mean, I've seen the announcement that Mr. Carney made about removing trade barriers between provinces of Canada. I mean, that seems a sensible thing to me, a positive thing, but really that's for Canada to decide. At its heart, always the UK is a free trading nation. You know, we don't like tariffs. That's not our kind of preferred way of working. So our ethos will always be, you know, where we can have liberal arrangements, where friction is removed. That would always be our preference. But we don't want to. You know, it's not our place to interfere in Canadian domestic policy on that.
Thank you. Another question? Yes.
Thank you very much. The panel has rightly said that Trump does not like multilateralism. He tends to be transactional. He likes bilateral negotiations where he's the bigger player. He's also, Trump 47 is a very different leader than Trump 45. There were more guardrails with 45 in terms of Congress and the courts, and now he feels absolutely unbound. I think this is probably the most dangerous time of his presidency, the next year, leading up to the midterms. And so what will his main objective be in 2 weeks at Kananaskis? What kind of outcome is in his head? Maybe a golden outcome.
Because he won't be able to shame 6 other leaders in an Oval Office type situation, right? Peter, maybe, and then Ed.
I think that's the big question, David. I mean, we don't know, and you can sort of put up your own guardrails in terms of how to conduct a meeting. The question we had at Charleroi, well, he didn't stay until the end. He left before the discussion on climate change, and after the luncheon on gender issues. So. Unpredictable in some ways, but predictable in others. It's clear that he wants to attend. The advance team has been out to both Calgary and to Kananaskis, and it will be a major presence. And it's also his first major foreign outing after his trip to the Middle East. So it gives him an opportunity then to sit with what is arguably his peer group and to have these discussions. And obviously there is a domestic political imperative behind all of this because he will play to his base. But in many ways, he's the senior statesman right now, and that's how the Americans, certainly those who voted for him, see him. So it will be an interesting event to watch, and I'm happy I won't be there.
Oh, Cindy. Cindy's maybe still listening. Ed?
Well, actually, I would love to be a fly on the wall in those bilaterals that happen. Given the fact that Donald Trump has very little, if any, interest in multilateralism, one should not expect that he's seeking consensus at the G7. He may leave early as well. He sees himself, rightly has been suggested, as the king, and he's going to rule it over his subjects, including countries that are in his orbit, economies that are in his orbit. You're absolutely correct. Many of the guardrails that were there for Trump point 1 are no longer there under Trump point 02. There is one guardrail, I believe, that is still in place, and that is the midterms, as I think you've suggested. And those midterms could put a halt to some of his most aggressive policies, because as I mentioned earlier in my comments, we aren't anywhere close to seeing the full consequences of his tariff policies going forward. These policies have an impact on the global economy, obviously, but they're going to have an impact on Americans. And how they react during the midterms will determine whether he feels he has unrestricted power to act almost as a dictator, as a strongman, really. He has many of the qualities of someone who would love to be a strongman. So far, American democracy has withstood this, but I don't know what it's going to look like after the midterms. And it's up to Canada to act in a constructive role to keep the U.S. in the tent as much as possible, because I strongly believe there is going to be a period when we're past the Trump era where we're going to have to restore that relationship with the largest economy in the world and allow that economy and whoever the leader is to save face. Anything we do within the G7 has to have a long-term strategy in mind for that relationship going forward.
Thank you. Oh, two more? Okay.
Hi. So on that vein, I mean, we have some burning issues on the table right now between U.S. and Canada. One of them being the extraction taxes, like the DST, that we know that Trump is really concerned about. Do you see a world where those types of conversations and those things get worked out at the summit? Like, will they work through the nitty-gritty of that? And where do you think Prime Minister Carney will go on that? And I agree with you. I think we need to keep them in the tent, and that would be a way to do that. But do you see that happening at the summit? Because the money's due at the end of the month. Go ahead.
Well, I do have a view on that. The digital services tax, I believe Canada was probably ahead of the curve there. We should have waited for a broad consensus, a global consensus, or at least a consensus among the developed nations on how a DST would work and be applied. Donald Trump has clearly made that a target in our bilateral relationship. And within the G7, I think there's an opportunity to find common ground, to maybe come out with some kind of a common statement on where the G7 nations want to go in terms of revisiting how a DST would apply, because the U.S. has tremendous power when it comes to that. You know, we're paying the price in Canada, as you know, for having implemented that tax without a global consensus on this. So I think we have a role to play. Canada has a role to play, but it's going to mean that Prime Minister Carney might have to put some water in his wine and say, hey, we're prepared to reconsider how we've implemented this and move back to trying to achieve a multilateral consensus on this.
Thank you. And one last question. Yeah.
Thank you. I thought I'd go back to the question of the value of the G7 as a forum, which is where Jennifer started. At one point in the past, not that long ago, the 7 countries were of approximately similar wealth and similar dynamism. I think of in 2017 when Mr. Trump was sworn in for the first time, the 7 countries were of about the same per capita wealth. But since then, over the course of the past 8 years, through 2 different administrations, the Americans have really powered ahead with an extraordinarily dynamic economy. The Europeans have regulated their digital industries into a slow growth pattern that just has not kept up. And of course, as Canadians, we can't boast because we will have the gold medal for strangling the productive factors of the economy into a declining per capita GDP that now puts us really at the bottom of the league. Everything that we've said here about the value of the G7 to the other 6 still applies, of course, because we want to be in the same room as the rich country that can offer so much. Is there going to be a 2-tier G7 going forward, and how can we survive that, where the focus of every G7 meeting is to keep the Americans from continuing to power ahead and just leaving us in their dust?
Who wants to take that on?
You're looking at me, Jennifer.
Well, I'm Genevieve and Ellen. I'm sure you can weigh in if you'd like.
I think that's a really good question, Ian. And the issue is at once productivity and assuming risk, and we haven't been good at both. Ed mentioned earlier that our small businesses they're too risk averse. And we have negotiators who negotiate fantastic trade agreements, and then we execute very poorly. So I think from what the Prime Minister has said, he wants to power the Canadian economy. I find you, as a former Prime Ministerial Chief of Staff, I find his selection of his new Chief of Staff very interesting too, because Mr. Blanchard is someone who understands economics in the context of where funds can best be raised and placed. And I think we really have to push hard on the innovation button. We talk about it, and that we don't do it. And infrastructure investment is going to have to figure very high, whether we're looking at pipelines or new routes to open ports in the Arctic and Hudson Bay or wherever. But I think that's the nub of it. I don't think a 2-tier G7 would work, because then how is that so different from the G20, where we also are? And the advantage of the G7 has been that more or less the leaders sit around a table as equals. Surely some are more equal than others, but I think when we've had the presidency, we've been innovative, we've been engaged. The 2 ministerial meetings, foreign and finance, that have taken place already will inform the leaders' table. There will be a few after that. We follow Italy in the rotation. The Italians had 22 ministerial meetings last year. We could never do that in this country, which wouldn't work. It would break the bank, and there'd be all kinds of questions and whatnot. So, but I think we bring something. I really think we bring something to this. And in the ones that I've sat in, when we're at an impasse at 3 a.m, as Sherpas, and someone would look at me and say, "Okay, it's time, Peter," and I'd say, "Time for what?" "It's time for the Great Canadian Compromise Initiative." And I'd say, "Okay." So maybe that's our value added. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I agree. I don't think a 2-tier G7 is attractive. No one wants to be on the B list. I think the reason the G7 works by consensus is because everyone at that table feels like an equal partner, regardless of your GDP. That there should be a sense that we're equal partners. But you're right. Economically, there is a difference, and I think there is a sense, certainly in the UK, that we need to catch up economically. The US is an economic powerhouse. I think there are lessons that we can learn from the US. The UK is, for example, taking a different approach when it comes to regulation, looking at reviewing how we regulate. Maybe we're over-regulating. The government right now with Keir Starmer has been very clear that the UK's primary objective is growth, growth, growth. And in all my times as a government official, I've never seen the whole of the UK government come behind that mission with such a coherence. I'm a career diplomat. To hear our Foreign Secretary tell all the diplomats that work for him that the number 1 mission of the Foreign Office is economic growth, you think, really? That's normally not what the Foreign Office is necessarily known for, but that's how the UK is approaching it. Every part of government is committed to this economic growth agenda. And this month, when we announce our industrial strategy, it will be a comprehensive whole of government approach to pursuing that very ambitiously, very aggressively. So, yes, I think there's catching up to do. There's positive signs in the UK. In the last quarter of this year, amongst the G7 countries, economic growth was fastest in the UK. So hopefully, we'll be in the right place on this.
Great. Minerva, because I saw you waiting for a question, and that'll be absolutely the last.
Thank you so much. Minerva from the One Campaign. There have been some talks that there are conversations about inviting the President of South Africa to the G7. The Senate recently brought out a fantastic report around strengthening Canada's relationship with the continent. Senator Peter, I think you were part of that, and thank you, by the way, for always supporting the One Campaign and the issues we bring to the Hill. But the government also released its Canada-Africa strategy recently. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are around trade partnerships with the African continent being part of the discussions at the G7, or are we too saddled with the risk aversion posture that was mentioned earlier?
That's a great question. Anyone have any thoughts?
Well, as someone who has a sister who's spent the last 30 some odd years in South Africa in the machinery of government there, I'm keenly aware of the opportunities on the African continent for Canada to do business and do it in a way that reflects our Canadian values. We talked, and you mentioned risk aversion that Canadian companies have. If we're risk averse when it comes to the EU under CETA, think of how risk averse Canadians will be doing business in Africa. Large companies, Canadian companies, are doing business in Africa with mixed success. As you know, there are challenges in working in countries like Mali. And I think that's always been the biggest challenge for Canadian companies is how do you manage the risk involved in a dynamic continent where the opportunities are great, but the risks are profound. And I don't know, I don't have an answer on how we navigate that, but it's certainly an area of the world that we have to be cognizant of, given the fact that there is this huge vacuum being created by the United States as it abandons its leadership within the global economy.
Okay, Peter, you are the absolute last answer.
Thank you, Minerva, for the question.
Thank you very much for the question. It's unfortunate our Senate report was almost finished, and then there was prorogation. So it'll be up to a committee when it's reconstituted to pick that up, because we had done a lot of deep diving, including in the issues that Ed just raised. But also there has to be an opportunity for the Global South, because the G7 cannot pretend it's the sort of steering committee for the world without the Global South involved. And that's why the President of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, has been invited to Kananaskis. He was present at Charlevoix as well, where we had a very good conversation with Global South countries on ocean plastics and other issues that I would say are quite pertinent. But we're looking at 54 countries, and the demographics are such that the population is going to increase tremendously over the next generation or two. And there are all kinds of commercial and developmental opportunities that go beyond traditional handouts in terms of international development assistance. And I applaud you, because I know one is working on that. So
Thank
say
you.
hi to Bono.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Peter, Alan, Geneviève, and Ed, for a fantastic discussion. Appreciate that you took time out to engage. Thank you.
And thank you to everybody for attending and for your questions. And I want to pass it over to the IRPP's chair of the board, Elizabeth Roscoe, to close things off.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. What a great panel. Really want to thank each and every one of you and Cindy, who started us off. I hope she stayed to hear some of the constructive recommendations and ways in which her next 2 weeks might roll out. But really, truly, on behalf of IRPP, these are the kind of forums that we hope to not only continue with all of you, but right across the country as we continue our work on public policy and outreach to communities. And I wanted to, of course, acknowledge our former Minister of International Trade, our Sherpa, current and former, our representatives from the UK and from the EU, and as well Jennifer and team IRPP. Thank you for all of your work.